The Night Hunter's First Kill. March 7th, 1944, 11,000 feet above the Pacific darkness near Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Dale Haberman sat in the cramped cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow, America's first purpose-built night fighter, surrounded by the soft green glow of instrument panels. The jungle below was invisible, swallowed by a moonless night so complete it seemed to erase the boundary between earth and sky. Behind him, in the aircraft's central pod, radar operator Lieutenant Ray Mooney hunched over the glowing screen of the SCR-720 airborne intercept radar, watching for the distinctive blip that would signal an enemy aircraft. At 29 years old, Haberman was older than most fighter pilots, a former airline pilot whose night flying experience had made him valuable when the Army Air Forces began forming night fighter squadrons. He'd flown 47 night patrols without firing a shot in anger. Japanese bombers had learned to avoid American-controlled airspace, or so it seemed. The monotony of endless dark patrols was wearing on everyone's nerves. "Contact!" Mooney's voice crackled through the intercom, professional and calm. "Bearing 020, range 8 miles, altitude approximately our level." Haberman's hands moved automatically to the controls, adjusting course toward the unseen target. The Black Widow responded smoothly, its twin Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engines purring with 2,000 horsepower each, pushing the massive fighter through the night air. At 30,000 pounds fully loaded, the P-61 was enormous for a fighter, nearly as large as a medium bomber. But in the darkness, size didn't matter. Only electronics and firepower mattered. "Closing," Mooney reported. 6 miles now. Targets heading west, probably returning to Rabaul. Speed about 200 knots. The radar had found them long before any visual contact was possible. This was the revolution the P-61 represented, the ability to hunt and kill in total darkness using technology that seemed like science fiction just years earlier. The SCR-720 radar could detect aircraft at ranges up to 5 miles, track them, and guide the night fighter to within visual range, or what passed for visual range on a night this dark. 4 miles. Steady bearing. You should have visual in about 2 minutes if he has any lights showing. Haberman strained his eyes forward, searching the darkness for any hint of the enemy. Japanese bombers sometimes showed navigation lights, overconfident in the protection darkness provided. Most pilots never learned that darkness was no longer protection, not with Black Widows hunting the night skies. 2 miles. Mooney's voice held an edge now. The range was closing fast, too fast. Target's still steady. He doesn't know we're here. Then Haberman saw it. Not lights, but something darker against the dark, a shape blotting out stars. The distinctive twin-engine silhouette of a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, probably loaded with bombs intended for Allied positions. The Japanese were getting desperate, trying night raids to avoid the swarms of American fighters that controlled the daylight skies. Haberman eased the throttles back, letting the Black Widow decelerate to match the bomber's speed. His right hand found the gun trigger, thumb brushing the safety. The P-61's armament was concentrated in a remotely controlled dorsal turret, 420mm cannon with 200 rounds each. Devastating firepower, all aimed by the turret gunner, or in single-seat night fighter configuration by the pilot using radar ranging. 800 yards! Mooney called. "Steady! He still doesn't see us." Haberman positioned the Black Widow slightly below and behind the Betty, the classic night fighter approach that kept his aircraft in the bomber's blind spot while giving him a perfect shooting position. The Betty's vulnerable fuel tanks ran through the wings, unprotected. One good burst would turn the bomber into a fireball. 600 yards. You're in position. Haberman's thumb flicked off the safety. The red arming light glowed on his panel. The gun sight projected its dim reticle onto the windscreen, barely visible, a ghostly circle that framed the enemy bomber perfectly. Firing. The four 20mm cannon opened up simultaneously. The Black Widow shuddered as shells poured out at 600 rounds per minute. Four streams of tracer fire reaching out across the darkness like fingers of death. The effect on the Betty was instantaneous and catastrophic. The first shells hit the left engine, which exploded in a bloom of orange flame. More shells walked across the fuselage and into the right wing. The Betty's unprotected fuel tanks ignited. The Japanese bomber became a meteor, a ball of fire falling from the sky, pieces separating as the airframe disintegrated under the thermal stress. Haberman banked hard right, avoiding the debris field, watching as the burning wreckage tumbled toward the jungle below. The entire engagement had lasted less than 15 seconds from first visual contact to kill. "Splash one," Mooney reported, his voice steady, but with an underlying satisfaction. "Clean kill, no return fire." He never knew what hit him. Haberman circled once, watching the flames disappear into the jungle canopy below. Somewhere down there, Japanese aircrew were dead or dying, victims of a weapon they couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't escape. This was the future of air combat, he realized. Not the romantic dogfights of daylight, but cold, calculated killing in the dark, using technology that turned night from protection into death trap. As the Black Widow turned for home, Haberman keyed the radio. "Castle Base, this is Nighthawk 2-3. Bogey destroyed. Returning to base." The response was immediate, excited. "Roger, Nighthawk 2-3. Congratulations on the first confirmed P-61 kill in the Pacific Theater. Well done." First kill, Haberman thought. But it wouldn't be the last. The Black Widow had proven itself. And the Japanese were about to learn that darkness was no longer their friend. Jack Northrop's vision. To understand why the P-61 Black Widow represented such a revolutionary approach to air warfare, you have to understand the man who conceived it and the desperate circumstances that drove its development. Jack Northrop was a visionary aircraft designer whose career had been defined by unconventional thinking and technical brilliance. In 1940, while war raged in Europe and American involvement seemed inevitable, Northrop was already thinking about problems most military planners hadn't even recognized yet. The German blitz against Britain had demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of night bombing. RAF night fighters, converted day fighters with minimal modifications, were proving almost useless. British pilots, flying Hurricanes and Defiants with primitive airborne radar, shot down perhaps one German bomber in every 20 interceptions. The problem was fundamental. Day fighters optimized for speed, and maneuverability couldn't carry the heavy radar equipment, multiple crew members, and long-endurance fuel loads necessary for effective night operations. Northrop proposed something radical: building a fighter from the ground up specifically for night operations, not a converted bomber or modified day fighter, but a purpose-designed night interceptor that treated darkness as an operational advantage rather than a challenge to overcome. His design team at Northrop Aircraft in Hawthorne, California, began work in late 1940 on what would become the P-61. The Army Air Corps, impressed by reports of Britain's struggles, issued formal specifications in January 1941. But Northrop's design already exceeded those specifications in almost every parameter. The P-61's configuration was unlike any fighter before it. Twin booms extending back from the engines supported a large twin rudder tail assembly. The center nacelle housed the cockpit and armament in a design that allowed exceptional visibility and weapon placement. The high wing position gave the radar operator in the pod behind the pilot an unobstructed view forward and allowed the aircraft to carry heavy loads without ground clearance issues. "We're not designing a day fighter," Northrop told his engineering team during one of the early design reviews. "We're designing a weapons platform that happens to fly. The mission is everything. Find the enemy in total darkness, close to killing range without being detected, and deliver overwhelming firepower before he can respond. Everything else is secondary." The twin Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engines, the same power plants used in the P-47 Thunderbolt and F-4U Corsair, gave the Black Widow genuine fighter performance despite its size. Maximum speed approached 370 miles per hour, respectable for 1944. But more importantly, the engines provided the electrical power necessary for the radar systems and the endurance for patrol missions lasting 4 to 5 hours. The SCR-720 radar was the heart of the system. Developed by the MIT Radiation Laboratory, it represented the cutting edge of wartime electronics. A small rotating antenna in the aircraft's nose transmitted radio pulses and received echoes from enemy aircraft. The radar operator could detect targets at ranges up to 5 miles and track them with precision sufficient to guide the pilot to visual range, even in total darkness. But the SCR-720 was temperamental, requiring constant maintenance and skilled operators. Early models overheated, failed at critical moments, or produced false returns from ground features or weather. Training radar operators became as important as training pilots. The Black Widow required a crew of 3, pilot, radar operator, and gunner, working in perfect coordination. This was team hunting, not individual combat. The armament reflected the aircraft's purpose. 420mm M2 cannon mounted in a remotely controlled dorsal turret provided devastating firepower. Later models added 4.50 caliber machine guns in a ventral pack, though these were often removed in operational service because pilots found the cannon sufficient. The 20mm shells could destroy any aircraft with a single sustained burst, and the high rate of fire, 600 rounds per minute per gun, meant even brief firing opportunities resulted in hits. The Black Widow's first flight came on May 26, 1942. Test pilot Vance Breese climbed out after the 25-minute flight and made a statement that captured the aircraft's unique character. "It's not a fighter in the traditional sense. It's a hunter. Patient, deadly, and nearly impossible to escape once it's found you." Training the night hunters. Creating effective night fighter crews required rethinking fighter pilot training from the ground up. The 481st Night Fighter Operational Training Group, established at Orlando Army Air Base in Florida in early 1943, developed an intensive program that was unlike anything in the Army Air Forces. Captain Richard Blanchfield, one of the original instructor pilots, described the challenge. "We're not teaching dogfighting. We're teaching discipline, patience, systematic search patterns, crew coordination, and cold-blooded killing. These are skills that don't come naturally to fighter pilots. Most fighter jocks want to mix it up, turn and burn, prove they're better than the other guy. That gets you killed at night. Night fighting is about using your advantages, your radar, your darkness, your firepower to kill the enemy before he knows you're there." The training program lasted 16 weeks, twice as long as standard fighter training. The first phase focused on instrument flying and night navigation. Student pilots spent dozens of hours under the hood, learning to trust their instruments completely because visual reference was useless in the dark. They practiced flying precise courses and approaches in total darkness, landing with minimal lighting, dealing with equipment failures and emergencies without visual cues. The second phase introduced the radar operators and gunners. These men, typically experienced bombardiers or navigators, underwent specialized training on the SCR-720 system. They learned to interpret the radar returns, distinguish aircraft from ground clutter, calculate intercept courses, and guide pilots to targets they couldn't see. The best radar operators developed an almost intuitive understanding of the glowing scope, reading information that wasn't explicitly displayed. Crew coordination exercises consumed the third phase. Pilot, radar operator, and gunner had to function as a single unit, communicating constantly, anticipating each other's actions, maintaining perfect coordination during complex intercepts. They practiced in simulators, in the air against towed targets, and against other P-61's, playing the role of enemy bombers. "The pilot flies the aircraft," Blanchfield explained, "but the radar operator fights the battle. He finds the target, calculates the intercept, guides the pilot into position, and calls the range. The pilot's job is to put the aircraft where the radar operator needs it to be and then deliver the firepower. It requires complete trust. The pilot can't see what the radar operator sees. He has to believe in his radar operator absolutely." The final phase brought it all together in realistic combat exercises. Student crews flew against B-24 Liberator bombers, attempting evasive maneuvers in total darkness. The bombers had experienced crews who knew all the tricks: radical course changes, altitude variations, even shutting down engines to reduce radar signature. The P-61 crews had to find them, track them, and close to simulated firing range without losing contact. Lieutenant Robert Ferguson, a student pilot in Class 44B, recalled his first successful intercept. "We'd been chasing this B-24 for 20 minutes. He was good, changing course randomly, climbing and diving. My radar operator, Sergeant Miller, stayed locked on him somehow. He'd call out the turns before the bomber completed them, anticipating based on the radar return. Finally, Miller got me positioned perfectly, 600 yards dead astern, same altitude. I flipped on the gun sight, and there he was, right in the reticle. In combat, he'd have been dead. Never knew we were there until we hit him with the searchlight to signal the kill. The washout rate approached 40%. Some pilots couldn't master instrument flying. Some radar operators couldn't interpret the scope under stress. Some crews simply couldn't coordinate effectively. But those who graduated were among the most highly trained air crews in the Army Air Forces. By mid-1943, trained P-61 crews were completing the program and deploying to combat theaters. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron went to Guadalcanal. The 422nd went to England. The 548th deployed to New Guinea. And everywhere they went, the Black Widow's reputation began to grow. The Pacific Night War. The P-61's combat debut in the Pacific Theater came at a critical time. Japanese forces, reeling from defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, had shifted increasingly to night operations to avoid American air superiority. Japanese bombers raided Allied bases under cover of darkness, harassing attacks that disrupted operations and demoralized ground troops who couldn't sleep through constant air raid alerts. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron, equipped with P-61's, arrived at Guadalcanal in late March 1944. Their mission was simple in concept, but fiendishly difficult in execution: protect Allied bases and shipping from Japanese night attacks across thousands of square miles of Pacific darkness. Lieutenant Commander John Anderson, the squadron's operations officer, described the tactical situation. The Japanese knew we couldn't touch them at night. Our P-38s and P-40s were useless in the dark, so Japanese bombers would come over at midnight, drop their loads, and fly home unmolested. Our troops on the ground couldn't sleep. The constant alerts were exhausting. Morale was suffering. We needed to make the Japanese afraid of the night again. The Black Widow's operational pattern was methodical. P-61's would take off at dusk and orbit at predetermined patrol stations, typically 50 to 100 miles from the base, at altitudes between 10,000 and 15,000 feet. The SCR-720 radar constantly swept the sky, searching for contacts. Ground-based radar controllers would vector the night fighters toward suspected enemy aircraft. But the P-61's onboard radar made them largely independent hunters. On April 2, 1944, Lieutenant Ernest Thomas and his crew scored the squadron's second kill. Thomas's radar operator, Sergeant Edward Copsell, picked up a contact at 9 miles range heading toward Guadalcanal. The intercept took 12 minutes, a careful pursuit that kept the P-61 in the enemy's radar shadow while Thomas maneuvered for the perfect firing position. "We closed to 800 yards before I had visual," Thomas reported. Betty bomber, no light showing, completely unaware. Copsell had us positioned perfectly, slightly below and behind. I moved up to 400 yards, centered him in the sight, and fired a 3-second burst. The 20-millimeter shells just tore him apart. The right wing separated, then the tail. The fuselage tumbled burning into the sea. Total time from first shot to crash: maybe 8 seconds. He never fired a shot in return. The psychological impact on Japanese bomber crews was immediate and severe. Suddenly, darkness wasn't safe anymore. American night fighters could find them, track them, and kill them without warning. Japanese pilots began reporting contacts with black airplanes with glowing eyes, a reference to the P-61's radar emissions that appeared as a faint glow visible at close range. By May 1944, Japanese night attack rates had dropped by 60% in areas covered by P-61 patrols. The Black Widows weren't shooting down huge numbers of aircraft. The total kill count remained modest, but the deterrent effect was enormous. Japanese bombers that ventured into P-61 patrolled airspace rarely returned. Those that did brought stories of unstoppable night hunters that motivated other crews to refuse missions. Captain James Bradford, who would finish the war as the Pacific Theater's top-scoring P-61 ace with 7 kills, described the hunting technique. Patience is everything. You orbit your station, sometimes for hours, listening to the radar operator call out the search pattern. Contact, good contact. Then you become a machine. The radar operator calls the turns. You fly them exactly. He calls the speed adjustments. You make them precisely. You close slowly, methodically, never rushing. At 1,000 yards, you start looking for visual. At 600 yards, you should have him. If it's dark enough and you've done everything right, he still doesn't know you're there. Then comes the moment, Bradford continued. You're 400 yards behind an enemy bomber. Your cannon are armed. The sight is on target. You squeeze the trigger, and it's over. 4 20-millimeter cannon at that range don't wound aircraft. They disintegrate them. I've never fired more than a 5-second burst. Never needed to. The P-61's firepower is so overwhelming that if you're in position, the kill is guaranteed. The Black Widow's success in the Pacific demonstrated the aircraft's core concept. Night fighting wasn't about aircraft performance in the traditional sense. It was about sensors, coordination, and firepower. The P-61 wasn't the fastest fighter or the most maneuverable, but in the dark, those attributes didn't matter. What mattered was finding the enemy first, closing undetected, and delivering killing firepower before the enemy could respond. The European theater. While P-61's hunted over Pacific jungles, other Black Widow squadrons deployed to Europe faced an entirely different challenge. The Luftwaffe's night fighter force was the most sophisticated in the world, equipped with advanced radar-equipped aircraft like the Bf-110 and Ju-88, flown by experienced crews with hundreds of hours of night combat experience. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron arrived in England in May 1944, just weeks before D-Day. Their mission was to protect Allied bomber streams from German night fighters and to conduct offensive patrols over occupied Europe. The European Night War was far more intense and technologically advanced than the Pacific Campaign. Major Leon Lewis, the 422nd's commander, briefed his crews on the tactical situation. Gentlemen, the Luftwaffe has been fighting this war for 4 years. Their night fighter crews are veterans. They have excellent radar, ground control systems that vector them precisely to targets, and tactics refined through hundreds of engagements. We have better equipment and heavier firepower, but they have experience. Don't get overconfident. These aren't Japanese bombers blundering through the dark. These are professional hunters, just like us. The Black Widow's European debut came on July 15, 1944. Lieutenant Hermann Ernst and his crew were patrolling at 15,000 feet near Caen when their radar operator detected a contact. The intercept was textbook perfect. Ernst closed from behind, identified the target as a Bf 110 night fighter, probably hunting for RAF bombers, and fired a brief burst from 300 yards. The German fighter exploded, its ammunition and fuel igniting simultaneously. But the next encounter went differently. On July 23rd, Lieutenant Paul Smith's P-61 was itself bounced by a German night fighter. The Luftwaffe aircraft, possibly equipped with the new Naxos Z radar detector that could home on Allied radar emissions, attacked from below, raking Smith's Black Widow with cannon fire. The P-61's rugged construction saved the crew. Despite serious damage, Smith nursed the aircraft back to England and crash-landed at the first available airfield. The lesson was clear. In Europe, the Black Widow faced opponents who understood night fighting as well as American crews did. The technological advantage was smaller, and German crews had developed effective countermeasures. Some German night fighters flew with radar detectors, turning the P-61's greatest strength into a liability. If the Black Widow was actively searching with radar, it advertised its presence to any aircraft equipped to detect radar emissions. American crews adapted quickly. They learned to use radar sparingly, relying on ground control for initial intercept vectors and only activating their SCR-720 for the final approach. They studied German night fighter tactics and developed counter-tactics, and they accepted that in Europe, night combat was a two-way fight. Captain Tadas Spellis became the European theater's top P-61 ace with 6 kills, all German night fighters. His success came from treating every intercept as a potential trap. "I always assumed the German knew I was coming," Spellis explained. "I'd position for the attack, but keep my head swiveling, watching for the second German. They often flew in pairs, one as bait and one as the killer. If I'd focused solely on my target, I'd have been dead a dozen times." The P-61's firepower proved decisive in these engagements. In the few head-on encounters that occurred, the Black Widow's 420mm cannon outgunned anything the Luftwaffe deployed. German Bf 100s carried 20mm and 30mm cannon, but typically in upward-firing installations optimized for attacking bombers from below. In a direct fight, the P-61's concentrated forward firepower was overwhelming. By late 1944, P-61 squadrons in Europe had established themselves as effective night fighters despite the sophisticated opposition. They flew escort missions for RAF bomber streams, conducted offensive patrols over Germany, and hunted V-1 flying bombs during the weapons campaign against England. The Black Widow proved versatile enough to handle whatever missions commanders assigned. The vulnerability emerges. The P-61's dominance in night operations seemed absolute through 1944, but careful analysis by both American and enemy air forces was beginning to reveal the aircraft's fundamental vulnerability. The Black Widow's effectiveness depended entirely on darkness. In daylight, the massive twin-boom fighter became a different aircraft altogether, one with serious limitations. This vulnerability first became apparent during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes under heavy cloud cover that grounded most Allied aircraft. In desperation, commanders ordered all available aircraft into combat, including night fighters. P-61 squadrons found themselves flying daylight ground attack missions, strafing German columns and attacking targets of opportunity. The results were sobering. Lieutenant James Ketchum's P-61 was hit by ground fire during a strafing run on December 18th. The aircraft's large size made it an easy target for German anti-aircraft gunners. Ketchum managed to reach Allied lines before crash landing, but the aircraft was a total loss. 2 days later, another P-61 was shot down by ground fire during a similar mission. More concerning was the Black Widow's vulnerability to German day fighters. On December 22nd, a P-61 on patrol near Bastogne encountered a pair of FW-190s. The German fighters immediately recognized the American aircraft's limitations. The Black Widow's size and weight, irrelevant at night, became fatal liabilities in a daylight dogfight. The FW-190s attacked from different angles, using their superior roll rate and climb performance to position for killing shots. The P-61 pilot, Lieutenant David Crawford, fought desperately, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Black Widow couldn't turn with the German fighters, couldn't climb with them, couldn't accelerate away. Crawford managed to damage one FW-190 with a lucky burst, but the second German put 20mm shells into the P-61's left engine. The aircraft went down in flames. Crawford and his radar operator bailed out and survived as prisoners. The gunner died when his parachute failed to deploy. This engagement revealed the core problem. The P-61 was optimized for one mission profile, night interception, at the expense of all-around fighting capability. Its size, weight, and relatively modest power-to-weight ratio made it unsuitable for daylight combat against contemporary fighters. The aircraft that was a hunter in darkness became prey in daylight. The vulnerability extended beyond just air-to-air combat. The P-61's large radar signature made it visible to German radar at considerable distances. Its size made it easy to spot visually. And its relatively slow speed, 370 miles per hour maximum, slower than most contemporary fighters, meant it couldn't outrun threats. Colonel Winston Kratz, commanding officer of the 9th Air Force's night fighter operations, filed a classified report in January 1945 analyzing the Black Widow's limitations. The P-61 is the finest night fighter in the world. Its radar, firepower, and crew coordination capabilities are unmatched. However, the aircraft is strictly a night operations platform. In daylight, it is vulnerable to both air and ground threats. Missions requiring daylight operations should be assigned to other aircraft types. The report recommended that P-61s be restricted to night operations exclusively, with day fighter types handling any missions that might extend into daylight hours. This recommendation was generally adopted, though desperate situations occasionally forced Black Widows into daylight combat with predictable results. The psychological impact on P-61 crews was significant. They'd grown accustomed to being the hunters, the invisible predators of the night sky. Encounters where they became the hunted, where their advantages disappeared and they faced opponents on unfavorable terms, were profoundly unsettling. Lieutenant Robert Hayes described the feeling after escaping a daylight encounter with German fighters. "At night, I'm confident, almost invulnerable. We have every advantage. But in daylight, everything changes. The P-61 feels slow, clumsy, huge. every enemy fighter looks faster and more agile. You realize that everything that makes you effective at night makes you vulnerable in daylight. It's like being two different aircraft depending on the sun. The Mosquito comparison. By early 1945, comparison between the P-61 Black Widow and Britain's de Havilland Mosquito night fighter became inevitable. Both aircraft served the same basic mission, but they represented radically different design philosophies. These differences would influence post-war night fighter development and ultimately determine which approach became dominant. The Mosquito was smaller, lighter, and significantly faster than the P-61. Powered by two Merlin engines, the Wooden Wonder could reach 380 miles per hour in fighter configuration and could be pushed to 400 miles per hour in stripped-down variants. More importantly, the Mosquito was agile enough to hold its own in daylight combat. RAF, Mosquito night fighters, regularly flew intruder missions deep into German territory during daylight hours, hunting German aircraft on their own airfields. The P-61's advantages lay in radar capability, endurance, and firepower. The SCR-720 was superior to the British AI Mark 10 radar in range and resolution. The Black Widow's 4 to 5 hour endurance exceeded the Mosquito's by over an hour, critical for patrol missions, and the 420mm cannon delivered heavier firepower than the Mosquito's armament. Captain James Luma, an American pilot who flew exchanges missions in RAF Mosquitoes before joining a P-61 squadron, provided a direct comparison. The Mosquito is a fighter that happens to work at night. The P-61 is a night operations platform that happens to be armed. If you need to operate in darkness, and only darkness, the Black Widow is superior. Its radar is better, it can stay up longer, and its firepower is devastating. But if there's any chance of daylight combat, or if you need to penetrate defended airspace, the Mosquito is the better aircraft. It's fast enough to escape trouble and maneuverable enough to fight its way out. The performance difference became stark when both aircraft types were assigned to similar missions in the European theater. Mosquitoes flew deep penetration night intruder missions, attacking German night fighter bases and transportation networks. These missions often extended into dawn, requiring the Mosquito crews to fight their way out of German airspace in daylight. P-61s, by contrast, operated primarily in areas where Allied air superiority was already established. They flew defensive patrols over friendly territory and limited offensive missions where daylight exposure was unlikely. The rare occasions when Black Widows attempted deep penetration missions resulted in losses that discouraged repeat attempts. The speed difference was particularly telling. The 30 miles per hour advantage the Mosquito held might seem modest, but in combat situations, it was the difference between escape and death. A Mosquito pursued by German day fighters could often extend the range and break contact. A P-61 in the same situation had to fight or die. Major Harry Johnson, who commanded a P-61 squadron in the Pacific before transferring to Europe, observed both aircraft types in operation. The Mosquito crews operate with a freedom we don't have. They go anywhere, anytime, because they know they can handle whatever they encounter. We have to be more careful, more selective about missions. It's frustrating because our radar and weapons are better, but their speed compensates for a lot. The comparison extended to crew coordination. The Mosquito required only two crew members, pilot and navigator/radar operator, compared to the P-61's three. The smaller crew meant simpler logistics, easier training, and more operational flexibility. It also meant the aircraft was lighter and therefore faster. British night fighter doctrine reflected the Mosquito's capabilities. RAF Mosquito squadrons conducted offensive operations throughout German-controlled territory, hunting enemy aircraft, attacking ground targets, and generally making night operations hazardous for the Luftwaffe. American P-61 doctrine was more conservative, emphasizing defensive patrols and carefully planned offensive missions in areas where daylight exposure could be avoided. By war's end, the performance comparison clearly favored the Mosquito's balanced approach. A night fighter that could survive daylight encounters was more operationally flexible than one limited strictly to darkness, even if the darkness-optimized aircraft had better sensors and weapons. This lesson would profoundly influence post-war night fighter development. The final months. As the war in Europe entered its final phase in early 1945, P-61 operations began to change character. German night bombing had virtually ceased. Luftwaffe night fighter forces, decimated by fuel shortages and pilot losses, rarely ventured into Allied-controlled airspace. The Black Widow found itself hunting for targets that barely existed. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron's mission logs from March 1945 tell the story. Of 347 night sorties flown that month, only 8 resulted in radar contacts. Of those 8 contacts, 5 were identified as friendly aircraft. 3 were potential hostiles, but all 3 escaped before intercept could be completed. Not a single kill was scored. The night sky over Europe had become empty. P-61 squadrons adapted by shifting to ground attack missions. The Black Widow, despite its limitations as a day fighter, proved surprisingly effective as a night ground attack aircraft. Its long endurance allowed extended loiter times over German supply routes. Its radar could detect trucks and trains moving in darkness, and its heavy armament could destroy ground targets with devastating efficiency.